Hey there again. In the screencast, I want to talk a little bit about Flexbox and Grid with CSS. So the last couple of weeks, I've been talking about how to create layouts using CSS. The first sort of halfway to do it is using the display property to basically convert a block level element to inline or vice versa. That's one way you can get elements to sit next to each other or to just, behave differently based on whatever layout type thing you're looking to do. So you can use the display property. The next thing we talked about was using float. You can use float to get objects to sit next to each other. Obviously, float can be a little tricky in terms of getting widths just perfect when you add padding and margin in. Sometimes it's great at one browser width, but then as soon as you start narrowing things, the floated object might go underneath the other object. So float is pretty good, but not perfect. The third method for creating layouts in CSS is positioning. So you can absolutely or relatively position objects on the page, thinking of the page as basically an XY grid. As soon as you position an element, it's removed from the natural flow, so it sort of sits on its own plane. So you've got an XYZ grid or a third dimension. That also can get a little complicated, and positioning, as I mentioned in that screencast, is best used for things like sticky headers, pop-ups that need to sort of sit on top of a page and maybe animate separately. Actually, I realized another example of when you would want to use positioning is something like this. I don't know what to call this, sort of a watermark, I guess. Something that needs to sit in a specific part of the page. So it's not literally overlapping with this area, but it's sort of, taking up space separately from the space that this whole header section is taking up. So if we look at the inspector, you can see this is absolutely positioned. If I undo that, you can see this is now behaving like a regular, it's been converted to a block level element. So it's taking up the full width of the container, and whatever comes after it in the flow of the HTML starts on a new line. Anyway, so we've got display, we've got float, we've got positioning. So those are three ways to create layouts using CSS. And those are all valid and can still be used. And again, they have their sort of pros and cons and best uses. In the last few years, two other methods have come out as part of the latest release of CSS, CSS 3, which has been out for a while now. But they're called Flexbox and Grid. And these have become more standard as more browsers have been adapting them. There's always a problem, of course, with web development of having to make sure that your website works on all browsers, including old versions of browsers that some people or some companies might still have installed on their computers. Usually that issue is with Internet Explorer, but that's becoming less of an issue as time moves on. Anyway, Flexbox and Grid are two different approaches to creating layouts using CSS, and they are becoming more of the standard approach. So I'm just going to do a very quick introduction here. It can get pretty complicated. So I'm just going to do a quick overview, and keep in mind that if you do the next class, Web Coding 2, I think it's called, you're going to go into much more detail with Flexbox and Grid to create more complicated layouts. Okay, so on my site and in this little demo file, which I'll make available, I've linked to two guides on this csstricks.com site. You'll notice I've linked to this site a lot. I find it very helpful. There's a ton of tutorials and overviews on here that are, again, very useful. Okay, so we've got Flexbox and we've got Grid. Flexbox, the first one, but both of them allow us to create layouts. Flexbox is typically best used for a layout that's going to be a little bit more two-dimensional, I guess, so just like going in one direction, whereas Grid is a little smarter in a way and is best used when you need to create more complicated layouts that have both columns and rows. Of course, one would think, why wouldn't you just use the HTML table tag for that? Tables should be used for presenting data. What we're doing is laying out elements on a page. So whenever you're dealing with the layout of different elements, like content boxes, logos, navigational elements, footers, headers, that kind of stuff, you should never use HTML tables. You should always use CSS for any presentation elements on your page. Okay, so Flexbox. Let me go over to my example here. So what I have is something we're used to looking at. I've got a container div. So that's what this is, with a class that I've created called Flex Container. And inside I've got 3 nested divs, all with the same class called box. So these 3 nested divs are all on the same level. They are all children of the parent element, which is that Flex Container. So what I want to do is convert this, actually let me refresh this page here. Okay, so without any, without using, display or float or position, these boxes show up like this. So if we look at my CSS, all I've done is created, so here's my Flex Container, and I'm saying for any element that has the box class within it, give it a border and a width. And actually, let me get rid of width for the time being. So without that width, it's a block level element, it's a div, so it's going to take up the full width of the page. Next thing is going to show up on the next line. So this is the default behavior. What I'm going to do is, with both Flexbox and Grid, you're always having to figure out what the container is. So in this illustration here, the purple is the container, and then the children or the nested elements are these orange boxes. So whenever you're dealing with layouts, and specifically when you're dealing with Flexbox and Grid to create those layouts, you're always thinking about what are your individual containers, what are the boxes, or sorry, not containers, but what are the individual content boxes? And then in terms of Flexbox, we're thinking in terms of rows. So everything that is connected needs to be inside of a container. So I'm going to go back over here and apply the Flexbox property to it. And you'll notice that I'm actually using that display property, which we saw before. This is what we use to basically create a horizontal menu. We can use it to convert something that is a block level element and normally behaves as a block level element. We can convert that into an inline element. So display has a lot of other values, including flex and grid. So I'm going to just simply, on the parent container, the thing that contains those 3 boxes, I'm going to say display anything contained inside of this using Flexbox. So you can see, without any other code, it automatically takes all of those elements, those nested elements, and puts them on the same line. Basically, automatically converts it to a multi-column layout, the number of columns being determined by the number of nested divs. I'm going to go back up to my box class and add back in that 40%. So you can see it does all the math for me. Obviously, each of these can't quite take up 40%. That would be more than 100% of the page, but it gets close enough, and it knows that each of them should be taking up the same percentage, because I said 40% for both, so it divides the space equally between the three. Flexbox is also kind of interesting because it does allow you, there are different properties that go along specifically with Flexbox. One of them is flex direction. So I can, oops, I didn't mean row. I can tell this to flex in the column direction. So it defaults to row, which is what we saw without the flex direction property. So it assumes it needs to sort of lay out the boxes in a row within the container, or I can tell it to do it within a column. I can also reverse the children elements. So I'm going to tell it to flow in a row, or flex in a row, but in the reverse order. So of course my code here is box 1, box 2, box 3, but when I say row reverse, it has reversed those rows. So now it appears to start with 3 and then 2 and then 1. So there could be some situations where that's needed or useful, especially with responsive design. So maybe on a desktop, you want things to be, in this 3-column layout with this starting on the left and then your middle content and your sidebar content. But maybe on mobile, you want it to flip, so it's all stacked. And perhaps you want your content to be first, then your left navigation, then your sidebar. So you could theoretically do that with the flex direction, or another thing you can do, oops, actually I have to do this on the boxes themselves, is specify an order. So I'm just going to add these as inline styles just for this demonstration. Remember, inline styles are good for testing things out like I'm doing right now, but not for a production environment. So I'm going to say this should be number 4 in the order, this should be number 1, and this should be number 2. So I'm basically telling it to, even though my code has it so that it's 1, 2, and then 3, I'm basically telling it to show box 2 first, box 3 second, and then box 1 fourth, or in this case third. It's just the higher the number, the lower it's going to be. So 2, 3, and then 1. So that's another example of when you would want to do that, is what I described before with the responsive layout. You can add a media query that says, on mobile, when the device width is this or less, change the order of this element so that it shows first, and in this element so it shows last, or any number of scenarios. Last thing here with FlexWrap is, or with Flexbox rather, is the FlexWrap property. So I'm going to add in FlexWrap, and I'm going to tell it to wrap. So you can see what happens here. Without that, it made all 3 boxes fit in the 1 row. By adding FlexWrap with the value of wrap, I'm telling it to go ahead and allow wrapping within the row. So now it's actually making each of these boxes 40% of the available space, which of course can only be done if it wraps that last box. Without it, the default value is to not wrap, so it reduces the width of each to less than 40% so that they all fit in the same row. So that's Flexbox. This overview here, and there are many others on the internet, goes into a lot more detail. There are other properties that you can use related to Flexbox, but the basic idea is you have a container, you have elements inside, you tell the container to display as a Flexbox, which modifies the way that the elements, the nested elements, sit within that container. So again, you've got all of the properties that relate to the parent or the container, and then you also have properties that relate to the children, or in my case, those boxes. And that's the order, like I showed you, and there's a bunch of stuff related to sizing and alignment, both horizontal and vertical alignment. So there's a lot more stuff here with Flexbox. that you can go through in this overview. And then Grid, as I said, Grid is similar to Flexbox in that it also uses the display property, and it also relies on this idea of a parent element and container or nested elements. So on the container, you say display as grid, and then that then changes the behavior of the nested elements and how they sit in relation to each other. So let's go back to my example. So here is my grid example at the bottom. I've got a container with a class I've called grid container, and I've got 5 boxes in this instance. So without anything, they sit on top of each other. That's just the natural behavior of a block level element. I'm going to go to my CSS and say display as grid. Go back and refresh, and nothing actually happens. So remember, when I did display flex and nothing else, they automatically went into one row. With grid, you need a little more than just telling it to display as a grid. And again, when you're working with grid, you need to think of it as both, basically as a grid, as a table. So you need to think about your rows, the number of rows that you want these, the number of rows that you want these boxes to take up, and the number of columns that you want them to take up. So I'm going to start by using this property here called grid template columns. So you have grid template columns to define your columns, and you have grid template rows to define your rows. So basically what I'm saying here is display this content, this nested content, as a grid. The template I want you to use to define the columns is the first column should be 80 pixels, the second should be automatically sized based on what's left, and the third should be 150. So now I have something showing up here. Of course, I have 5 boxes, so I've got this little empty area over here, but that's okay because it just depends on what kind of layout I'm going for. But it's made this exactly, whatever I said, 80 pixels. It's made this exactly 150, and then the auto is just taking up what's left. Instead of auto, you can also use fractions. FR stands for fraction. So this one fraction is basically going to behave the same as auto. I can also say make each column be exactly equal, like one fraction of the space. So that's how I can get 3 equal columns. So you've got a lot of options here. So with this one, I gave it a relative value of %, 20%, and then these are each basically split what's left evenly. Let's see. So, and then you can do the same for rows. In most cases, though, I would start with your columns because that's kind of how we read things from left to right. The other thing you might want to do is use this grid gap property. Oops, not 220. Oh, need to spell it right. And that gives you, kind of like cell spacing and cell padding when we were dealing with HTML tables, that allows you to add automatic spacing in between your nested elements. And of course, the other thing I didn't show with the Flexbox is that Flexbox and Grid are automatically responsive. You're still, in most cases, going to want to create media queries to change the number of columns, for example, at different device widths, or any number of things. So as opposed to float, when we had issues with things sort of jumping to a new line at a certain width, Flexbox and Grid take care of that automatically. And you can, instead of just using grid gap, which is going to be the gaps between the rows and the columns, you can be specific and say, I want the rows to have a gap of 20, but I want the columns to have a gap of 100 pixels. So that just gives you a little bit more flexibility. Just like with Flexbox, if we look at this overview, there are a lot, actually way more properties than what I just went through related to the parent on this side and then related to the children. Again, these properties have to do with sizing, where things sit in relation to each other, alignment, and get a lot more complicated. But the basic idea is most developers, most front-end developers at this point are defining their layouts, their web page layouts, their designs using either Flexbox or Grid. It has some responsiveness already built in. You're still going to want to add media queries on top of that, of course. Flexbox is typically used when you have a layout that is focused more on either just columns or just rows. Grid would be used when you have a more complicated layout where you need more flexibility in defining both the horizontal and the vertical. And both of them, as I said, use this display property. I think that's just about it. So that's Flexbox and Grid. That was a very, very, very brief overview. I just wanted you to have a quick introduction to what they are. As you move forward in your own learning, or if you do take the next class, this is really where you would want to focus a lot of your attention on how to create layouts using Flexbox and Grid. If you have any questions or anything else you want to share, let me know.